Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you for our February podcast. If you haven't checked out the 5 minute video that this podcast is connected to, I will post the video in the show notes. The video that I posted is called Inclusion is Not Assimilation, which is a very big misunderstanding in the world of inclusion. And so I thought the first person that came to mind when I wanted to talk about this was one of our newest outside pins, Hina. Hina, say hi. So this is the incredible Hina, who I kind of stalked on Instagram for a few years before inviting her formally to do some work with me because I just want all the knowledge in your brain and my brain. So Hina, do you want to just take a minute and introduce yourself to the world? That actually really helps me understand your job more as well. When I first learned about occupational therapists, I was thinking, okay, so the word occupation, like to me, is like a job. So I was just like, what do OTs do with kindergarten kids? You know what I mean? Like I just didn't get it, but it totally makes sense. It's like they're like the useful life skills of the world.
Your time. That's kind of where the
So that
confusion comes from.
yeah,
But yeah, and you're not the only one that has thought of that. And I think as an OT, one of my biggest jobs is to advocate and help people understand what our profession is, which is always
it's
a fun conversation to have for sure.
but you know what? So now I'm thinking to occupy is probably where how jobs got connected to
Yeah.
yeah, so it's the opposite of what I
Yeah.
thought.
Yes.
See what I mean, you guys? She knows
Yeah, just learning.
everything. No, this makes so it's your what occupies your time.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness,
And I
Hannah.
mean, and then you can imagine why it's such a big
Oh,
umbrella, right? From
huge.
birth to death, there's like we do everything. So if there's anything that you need to do that you can't for some reason, whether it's a disability, injury, whatever has happened,
No.
our goal as OTs is to come in and work with our clients or our students and help you kind of get back to where you find that you need to be in terms of your meaningful everyday activities.
You're so, Hannah, you're so good. So, like, even just listening to you talk, the other reason why I wanted you on this particular episode is because you could even hear it. I don't know if anyone else has picked up on it, but you could even hear in the words that you intentionally choose to use. One thing that really stood out to me about you is that like even just what you just said, you're just like, so we can get you back to what you feel is what's meaningful to you. And that's very different than get you back to where society thinks you should be. Right. And to me, in my head, that's like the ultimate in neurodiverse affirming practices, which I think that you are incredible at. And so can you just speak to that piece right there, the difference between like what's meaningful for a person and what's meaningful for society?
Part of Outside Pin team also is that I feel like as an OT, I'm hardwired to think holistically. So OT is first and foremost a profession that focuses on health and well-being through occupational engagement. So thinking about, supporting students with disabilities from an OT perspective goes beyond just equipment recommendation. It's more what does that particular person need to do to be successful and who is defining that success? Not me as an OT, it is the person that I'm working with or the people that are supporting that person. So I think the holistic, every framework that we were taught in OT school is always has person centered in the middle or family centered in the middle. So I think that is such a crucial piece because we often do get bogged down in being like, well, this is generally the way we do things. So this is kind of the goal that you should work towards because that's what other 7 or 8 year olds are working towards. And no, absolutely not. It is very individualistic and very unique to that particular person. And what brings them meaning is kind of our focus.
And the other day you had a great example of this because you and I share a friend named Connor
Yeah.
who is a spicy. How old is he now?
I think Connor is 10 or 11 now, I think.
10 or
Yeah.
11. He is like
Yeah.
he is so spicy. And but he like knows what he loves. And
Yeah.
you know, like he's an actor and he is
Yes.
a
Very
singer
much.
and he is a princess and he wants to live that everything he does. And you know, you can see how you pull that in to everything you do with him. And so it's such a perfect example of all of
Yeah.
this because there's so many people who would look at that and just be like, "Oh, well, that's not what 10-year-olds should be doing." Do you
Should
know
be
what I
doing.
mean?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
and so this is kind of, you know, the direction that I wanted this video to go in. So my question to you, and I'll build on this as well, is, you know, I had a really big learning one day, which I'll share with you after I ask you this question,
Hmm.
which was the difference, like the difference between being included and being expected to assimilate.
Hmm.
And there is a line there that I don't think a lot of people even realize because a lot of people who are forced to assimilate are people who have less privilege than the dominant group. And so sometimes the dominant group doesn't even realize what's happening. And so my question to you is, what do you think the difference between inclusion and assimilation is?
Hmm. Yeah. That's a very big question. And I
It's
think it
huge.
is something as occupational therapists we think about all the time.
Mm,
So I think from my perspective, I think true inclusion boils down to equal opportunity.
mm,
So it's specifically person-centered opportunities to learn and grow. So I think inclusion often gets conceptualized as treating everybody exactly the same. That isn't necessarily the case. It's more about honoring each person's own unique learning needs, what they bring to the table, and how can we use that to not only help support them, but to better the people that are around them, right? How do we learn? I know that in you had shared a wonderful diagram in your book that had the different visual representations of segregation and
oh, the dots.
inclusion, the dots. Yeah,
I
and i
love
and i
those
remember when I
dots.
yeah, those dots are, and that's the thing, it's such a simple, clear visual, but it's so important. And I think it's such a great, and I use it all the time when I'm talking to my clients, education team, or families, being like, it's really, this is what it looks like, right? Like you can't, I mean, I remember, might be oversimplifying it a bit, but I remember growing up with, they're talking about the concept of melting pot versus a mosaic. Like, do we want to be a melting pot where everybody goes in and everybody kind of boils down to exactly the same thing, or do you want to be a mosaic where you each are part of one piece of fabric or one, but you each are bringing your own uniqueness to the mix. So I think it's really important that we kind of think about it with from that perspective.
And you know, like especially like as a student who never felt like they fit, and
Mm-hmm.
as now a parent of two little ones who like don't fit in any box, but they're also like three in one, so I don't know if they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Um, you know, the part that I found really frustrating going through special education and teacher education is that we're taught to assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
We're not taught to include. And so I feel like there's
Yeah.
this huge tension in the world, even outside of
Yeah.
education, where, you know, and if you've seen the dots, you know, like I'll use the metaphor of being green, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's this heavy, heavy, heavy expectation that inclusion means you have to become green in order to be successful. Can I tell you
Mm-hmm.
my big learning recently?
Yes, please. Yes, would love to hear it.
So I was looking at this article, and I don't remember in this moment who wrote it, but I'll tell you the gist. And the question was asking administrators and teachers, like, how do you know when inclusion has been successful? Like, how would you answer that question? How do you know when inclusion's been successful? What would you say?
I think that's a big question. I
How do
think
you know? Yeah.
it is, and I think inclusion. I think a successful inclusion would look like the person, like each and every person in somewhat, from an OT perspective, in somewhat being able to participate and engage in a particular environment. But it doesn't mean that they're engaging the same way, but that they're
Totally.
still happy and are part of the community that they're
Yeah.
in and are able to contribute in their own unique way.
So, like, just hearing that statement, I hear happiness, I
Hmm.
hear contribution, I hear participation. You know what I mean? Like, that's so you because that's so holistic.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Because all of
Yeah.
those things
Yeah,
create a sense of belonging, right?
for sure. Yeah.
Do you want to know what
Yeah.
one of the responses was in this research?
Yeah.
One of
Do I
one
want
of the
to know?
responses, you're gonna
I'm
die.
curious.
One of the responses in this research was, we know inclusion has been successful when the rest of the class isn't disturbed. But wait, it was
Oh,
disrupted. The rest of the class isn't
oh,
disrupted.
no.
And I was
Oh
like,
no.
no, 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 no. But this was
Mm-mm.
but Hannah, this was, I know. I made that face too.
Yeah.
But this was my connection. You ready? And I think you'll appreciate this. This word disrupt in the education world is a huge problem. Like, it's seen as a huge problem. When kids are disruptive, we need to get them out. We need to fix the problem. Like, something's wrong with them. But then, like, given the world's status right now,
Yeah.
I've noticed that the word disrupt is actually used very differently in the social justice world. In the
Mm-hmm.
social justice world, the word disrupt is a goal.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
then I was
Resistance and
like,
disruption.
right? Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we looked at the disruption of children in education in the
Yeah.
same way as we look at disruption in social justice worlds? Because then
Absolutely.
that
Love that.
student is communicating that there's no space
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah. And that change needs to be made. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
change in the space needs to be
Hmm.
made.
Needs to be made. Yeah. Can
I just
I?
couldn't sleep for
It,
days when I realized
that's
that,
so good. Yeah. I love that. And I
right?
think the other thing also is that oftentimes I'll have family when I do like IEP prep meetings or meetings with families, they're always, people have this other idea of inclusion being defined by physical proximity, right? So if you're in the same room, well, you're included. And oftentimes that is a checkbox that people do. And they're like, yeah, the student is included because they're in the same room. But um, can I quickly share an example of something
Yeah.
that I observed okay, so I went to a client's or student's grade one classroom a few years ago, and we got there in the morning when it was circle time. And this particular student was definitely part of the whole group sitting on the carpet. She was, kind of sitting there with a couple of peers, and the teacher at the front of the classroom was conducting circle time and talking about numbers and adding numbers or whatever. Now, this student, yes, was included, quote unquote, because she was physically close to everybody. But in watching her closely, her eyes were out the window. She was fidgeting with something on the floor. She was kind of turning around. She was looking at me. She was looking everywhere else. But now, again, somebody would say, well, this person's not paying attention, or they're not, really like engaging. But the thing is that person was physically there, but was not included in circle time, not through any fault of their own, but because the way circle time was set up, it wasn't truly inclusive. She had no piece to add to this. She wasn't given the opportunity to contribute to circle time. They were just expecting her to sit there, and that was inclusion in itself for them.
And
So
not
I
be
think,
disruptive.
and not being disruptive, exactly, because if she was up and moving around and
Yeah,
not participating in circle time, what would they do? Let's
totally.
go out in the hall, or let's go for a
That's
walk,
it.
right?
And
So
I
yeah.
feel so bad for so many of our support staff who, like, that's what the expectation is for them to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And that's not what their role is, right?
No,
And
absolutely
I
not.
mean, like, this is the part where, I know that, like, our teachers need support, right? Like, they need support to do this. And this is why the last video was a little controversial, is because I was, trying to say, like, our classrooms need supports, but just adding bodies to a room is not going to
Yeah.
create that sense of community and belonging. You can't force that. That's not a proximity issue. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? That is about like how are we using our adults in ways to facilitate that sense of belonging. And that requires adults, but it's articulating more about what the adults are doing, which really contributes to this. So, I mean, I think that's a really good example, Hannah, because, you know, if you don't know what to look for, you might look at that situation and say, "Oh, that's a successful inclusive activity." You know, and I even will say this sometimes, like, "Oh, I can't even pick out the kid with a disability." And I've catch myself sometimes and I'm like, "Is that really the goal?" You know what I mean? Like, why is it a problem that you can't pick them out? Because they look the same as everyone, because they're acting the same as anyone. So, even I had to like do some reflection and unlearning myself, because as a special educator, that's what I was taught to do is make them fit in. Okay, do you want to hear my story? You may have heard a version of this, but it's probably like this event happened on my birthday, and it was such a gift because it was probably the biggest learning I've ever had, ever. And so those dots that you refer to, right, in the book, um, I was using those dots to teach what inclusion is all over the world, right? And if you haven't seen them, it's like circles with a whole bunch of green dots and then a few dots that aren't green, right?
Yeah.
And I was telling everyone that that was inclusion. And then I was teaching a course at UBC, and one of my students pushed back on this. Now she was a graduate teacher, so she had a classroom. And
Yeah.
she's just like, I'm like, look at this great slide. Let's talk about it. She's like, I hate this slide. I'm like, why? Why do you hate this? Such a good slide. She's like, no. She's like, are the green dots supposed to be the normal children? And I'm like, well, sounds funny when you say it like that. She's like, are those non-green dots supposed to be the special needs children? And I'm like, maybe, and she just said, she's like, well, let's talk about that because, you know, first of all, I've never had that many normal children in my class. First problem. Second problem, those red dots are attached to red teachers and they follow red plans, and the blue dots are attached to blue teachers and they follow blue plans. She's like, but all of those plans are plans to make them green, right? And if you look at like IEPs historically and non-person centered planning, the success of inclusion is how much can we take away your disability or what makes you disabled, right? Or what makes you autistic or what makes you fill in the blank. And so it was such a profound learning for me because since I learned that, I hear from a lot of people who don't have my privilege, you know what I mean? Who aren't whites, who are, you know what I mean? And they're just like, "Oh, that's why I don't like inclusion every day is because the expectation is that I have to be like you."
Yeah.
And I'm like, thank you so much for pointing that out to me because that's the last thing I want people to think inclusion is. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the goal. It's not the goal. Okay, you ready for your next question? Okay, so the other part of this video that was important for me that I really wanted to highlight was if we want to maintain the integrity of disability, right? And autism and Down syndrome and the thing that makes kids who they are. Maintain the integrity of the person, okay? I want part of that is helping people to understand that disability in itself is an identity. It's not an impairment, right? And I know you understand that. Um, and so in the video, I advocate for opportunities for identities to come together in communities of identity. And there was even a comment on the video about this just being like, communities of identity, doesn't that just give permission for people to put people with disabilities together in a school? Right? So my next question for you is A, is there a place for disability to come together? Louder for the people in the back. Yes.
Like,
Yes.
from learning a lot of what we have been taught to learn about disability. So, like you said, we have to maintain the integrity, but we also have to maintain identity, right? Like it is, like you said, it is who you are as a person, no matter what disability you have. So, if someone is saying, well, well, let's group you with these other people or group you separately on your own, it's just like, well, then that disability is like, just completely canceled out. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. And I think there's so much more going on in the neurodiversity affirming approach and principles now is that we to some degree need to have either a neutral or a very positive look on disability, right? Of course, not everybody's going to have a very positive view on certain disabilities, but I can use an example. So from coming from my perspective and working with people with Down syndrome, I think this example would highlight really nicely why it's so important to have a community identity or a disability community identity. So if we look at the concept of friendships in people with Down syndrome, so oftentimes preschool through school, high school even, there's a lot of like, yes, people with Down syndrome should have, friends with that are neurotypical, but very often do they not have friends that have Down syndrome as well. I have very many of my students that have tons and tons of friends in their elementary school, birthday parties, play groups, all that don't have Down syndrome, but very few kids with Down syndrome or other disabilities. Now, having worked at DSR for so long, I have had the privilege of seeing a lot of our people kind of grow up into adults, and I see some of our adults now that are, after you leave that really tricky high school transition, when you come out, your neurotypical peers kind of go off, do their own thing, and you're kind of just left there, right? So your identity now is hanging in the balance of like, well, I kind of identified my friendships based off the neurotypical peers. But our adults that have had friends with Down syndrome have had the most long lasting, most enduring, most meaningful friendships. And I see that every day at work. So I think yeah, so it's one of those things to kind of think about how, if you're, especially as you're growing older and the gaps are increasing, life experiences may grow wider, but your friend with Down syndrome will generally be following a similar path alongside you, and you will have the most connection and the most deep, meaningful friendships with other people with disabilities. So that's what that community is so important to foster at a younger age as well.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes like people choose one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, you can have disability community. Oh, you can have neurotypical community. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
any other person on the planet doesn't operate that way. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Because like if I think
Exactly.
about my closest friends, the ones that are long time, years over different phases of my life, they're
Mm-hmm.
queer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
they
exactly.
are because you go through similar barriers, you navigate, you know what I mean, you navigate similar
Yeah,
celebrations, like you have
yeah,
so much in common because of who
yeah,
you are. And it doesn't mean that I only hang out with queer people. I also have very, very good straight
yeah,
friends and
yeah,
everything in between. And so I don't think this is a one or the other, but like how do we,
yeah.
part of what you said is like equal opportunity. Like I think our disabled kids need equal opportunity also for identity forming friendships.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity to connect with your own community is a form of inclusion in itself, right? So
Oh, for
forcing
sure.
students to form bonds with everyone, but not
Mhm.
giving them the opportunity to find that time to go and have their home base of people that are very similar to them, right?
Mhm.
So when you were talking about Connor, like he has another friend in his class that also has Down syndrome. They both hang out with other peers, but they both have each other as kind of like this grounding home base in the classroom, right? Because they
Yeah,
each, even though they're both very different people. So that's
totally.
also the other thing I don't want people to confuse, that we're not encouraging those friendships because they all think the same or they like the same things, but overarchingly, a parent I talked to yesterday described her adult son's group of friends with Down syndrome as like their tribe. It's just somewhere where you kind of go back to and you're just like, okay, I have
Your home.
this shared experience, your home. Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, I can feel people squirming listening to this because it's so nuanced, right? Because you hear things like this, be like, "Oh, Shelley Moore and Hina said that we can put kids with disabilities together." And I think that the criteria for a community of identity is that it has to be voluntary. It has to be a
Yes.
choice. Because as soon as I'm saying, "Oh, I'm going to put all the kids with disabilities together," all of that's no longer a congregated setting. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah.
when I think about the criteria of within a school, it's not about forcing people together in a port at all. It's like, how are we creating opportunities for kids to come together where they still have a choice? And so when I realized this one
Absolutely.
day, and this was, I was still school based and I was a high school support teacher,
Hmm.
and I have three students who have Down syndrome in my class, and we were invited to the district World Down Syndrome Day. And I was young, I didn't know anything, and I felt really weird about it because I was just like, why are we putting all the kids with Down syndrome in a gym? Like I didn't understand community of identity yet. I still was very much the, we shouldn't put people with disabilities together. You know what I mean? Like I didn't get it. I didn't get it yet. And so I was like humming and hawing, and I'm like, I don't know about this. Like, am I just facilitating opportunities for segregation, you know? And so we went, and I was skeptical, but like the first step in the door, you realize the difference between World Down Syndrome Day party and a segregated classroom in the basement of a school. Do you know what I mean? Like, this was not a place to put leftover kids. This was an absolute celebration of who these kids were and how they were so excited to see each other. And they made that day, they designed that day. It was all the things that they love, not the people without Down syndrome. And so I think, how that really helped me in my own job was, like we had a lovely community together when we were self-contained, right? And it was almost like we became a community of identity together. But if that's the only option, and if there isn't buy-in from the individuals, I don't know if we can call it a community of identity. No, we can't.
Forced assimilation all over again.
That's
Like, okay, I'll
exactly,
just put
that's
all of you
exactly,
guys together. Yeah. And I
totally.
guarantee you that that group, that World Down Syndrome Day celebration, while it was, primarily celebrating people with Down syndrome, planned by people with Down syndrome, but it is absolutely a community of identity that we can all celebrate if not having Down syndrome, right? Like we can
Exactly.
help be part of that community, even though we
Totally.
may not, so it's a nuanced balance thing. It, like you
Yeah.
said, it doesn't have to be one or the other,
Mhm.
but we need to really reflect on what that looks like and what is our place in someone else's community of identity, right?
That's
So for example,
exactly.
me as a Muslim female, like Ramadan is coming up, that is a huge communal experience within, the Muslim community, and I have friends that are just like, I will never know exactly kind of what you're doing, but I would like to fast alongside you just so that I can understand, right? So like it can be a collaborative communal experience
Yeah,
while
yeah.
still uplifting that community identity.
And I love that. It's uplifting. It's not, yeah, and you know what it also is? It's centering the community.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
centering, it's uplifting, it's
Yes,
celebrating. And like
absolutely.
maybe I feel like we need to make a checklist. I love checklists. We need to make a
Yes,
checklist for
love it.
how do you know if a community is a community of
Yeah,
identity or a community of assimilation?
yeah.
Whether it's because here's what's happening, Hannah. Oh my goodness.
Hmm.
This is the benefit of traveling the world,
Hmm.
is that people learned about communities of identity, which like in the literature is called congregation, where you
Hmm.
have chosen togetherness, whereas segregation is forced separation. So even just the language, right? And so I see a lot of historically self-contained and segregated programs just rebranding,
Hmm.
being like, oh, this is a congregated program. I'm like, but what has changed in the program? Is it a choice?
Yeah,
Is there another option?
yeah,
Do kids decide? Do kids build it? Right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
often
Yeah.
often the answer is no, right? Because I don't even think, I was thinking about this while I was driving. I'm like, I don't even think that if it's a program, it can be congregated because it means there's no other option.
There's no other options, exactly. Yeah, you're within a
And if
set
I was
boundary and
forced to
rules. Yeah,
only have community with gay people, I'd be exhausted. I
yeah,
can't party that much. Do you know what I mean?
yeah. Understandable. Yeah.
I mean, I need balance, Hannah.
You do need balance,
I
yes.
need balance.
Partying in its own right.
No, totally.
Yeah.
Hannah, I could talk to you for days. Okay, okay, you ready for your next question?
Yes, everybody.
Okay. So part of like the rush in making this podcast, because Hannah and I were talking before we recorded about how a lot of the content we create is off the side of our desk. And we're just like, I need to find an hour in this week, and it's going to be at 5 a.m. because that's the only time that I have, and then I get a cold. Like we're trying to navigate the world. But the reason why it's kind of last minute is because I want to get questions from the community about the video so that I can ask someone in the podcast about the question, right? So
Yeah.
the first one I asked you already, which was, are we walking a fine line? We're walking a fine line between community of identity and not, right?
Mhm.
But the second question, which I think is an interesting one, and I understand this is a real issue, but I think sometimes it gets mixed up. So something that I say in the video is, we're trying to create communities where kids feel, like you say, happy, safe, sense of belonging, contribution. Like we talk about all these things. Like really, like I love the term well-being. Like we want kids to have a positive well-being. Okay. And and I say this and I get in trouble sometimes because like sometimes I understand that we get caught up in minutes and location and it turns into a lot of forced movement. And if kids don't feel a sense of positive well being and are being forced around, that's going to come out sideways. And so, what I say that I sometimes get in trouble for is I would rather a student be meaningfully included for 5 minutes than to be non purposely integrated for 6 hours. Do you know what I mean? And, but we also can't stop. Like, we always have to be working on how do we increase the places where kids feel that sense of belonging. And so if a student is communicating in whatever way communication looks like for them, that this place is not working, if they're disrupting, when they're disrupting, you know what I mean? Often people say, because probably the biggest question I get is, yeah, but Shelley, all the challenging behavior. And so the question that came up was, we're focusing on individuals to feel safe, but what if the rest of the class doesn't feel safe? What if the adults don't feel safe? And I hate when the word violent gets thrown around because I don't believe that children are violent. And so, and it's a real issue. Like there are real people out there that don't feel safe. So how do we balance that very tricky line of, creating conditions for kids who have been extremely marginalized, right, to feel safe with the balance of the rest of the community feeling those things too. And honestly, it's probably the biggest question that I get. And so I'm curious about your response and then I'll jump in. But like what do you say when people say that to you? Yeah. And Hannah, honestly, you know everything. So like, I always kind of think about it like, because I mean, even if you take a really well trained special educator, like I was a very well trained special educator, and so much of the emphasis, and you know this too, like special education evolved out of the medical model, right? So, like, well meaning people have been conditioned to look at a situation where a child is struggling and think, what do I do to change them? What's broken in them? And the thing that I've come to realize, and this has been completely confirmed as a parent, is it is easier for us to change than them. it is it is easier for us to change.
Always on the person that is struggling.
No,
Like they're struggling. Why are we not,
no.
why
We
are we
are
not
the
working
ones.
on yes.
We are the ones that have
Louder, louder, Shelley, louder.
like even last night we're watching a movie and I like get caught up in this all the time. I'm like there's nothing wrong with them. There's something wrong around them. And then my daughter will do something. I'm like, "What's wrong with you?" You know what I mean? Like we
Awesome.
we have been so conditioned to view struggle as something that's wrong with a person. And I
Yes.
mean, if there's anything I could go back in time and tell myself as a first year teacher, it would be when someone is struggling, there's something wrong around them.
Yeah.
There are stairs in the way. And I just wish that some of our processes, because honestly, the first thing that we're taught to do is if a person is struggling, assess them.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
like, wouldn't it be
Yeah.
amazing if we could assess the environment?
Yes. Well, you're talking like an OT right now because 100% my OT, like I'm like getting so excited because one of the frameworks that, we as I'm sure you know, we get taught lots of frameworks and models and things to apply to our everyday practice. But one of the ones that I find is a really nice, simple model that I give to parents and educators is called like the PEO, person, environment, occupation. Right?
Mhm.
So imagine three circles. One is
Yeah.
for P, one is for E, one is for O.
Yes.
And Venn diagram those three together. If all three things are in balance, generally positive outcomes ensue, right? So we're looking at the person, but we're not looking at what the person is like, what's wrong with the person. Is like what are some of the factors that we need to do to support the person.
What are their
Then we're
needs?
looking
Yeah.
at the environment that we're going to, and that environment can include everything from equipment to the people, cultural norms, psychological,
Yeah.
characteristics, medical, especially with the population that I work with. Medical stuff
Mhm.
is a huge issue for these guys. So the environment and then the occupation. What are we asking them to do? What is the activity? What is the demand? And I ask teachers and parents, I'm like, anytime you're struggling with problem solving something that your child or student isn't able to do, sit down and think about the PEO model and figure out
Mhm.
how we can create that balance. So yes, the environment and the outside and what we're asking, and we're the ones that are putting the demands. We're the
Yeah.
ones that are getting these guys to follow our agenda, which is wholly unfair. So how
Yeah.
do we change, right, in order to help them?
This is a workshop waiting to be built, Hannah.
Yeah. Sorry, I got on my OT soapbox very,
No,
very
you are
easily,
welcome to stand on that soapbox anytime.
yes,
Because
exactly.
I'm drawing the diagram as you're
Yeah.
talking, and I'm like,
Hmm.
you could like that O, the occupying, the request for the demand.
Occupation. Yeah. Hmm.
You could break that down into
Yes.
learning and curriculum. You could break that down into like
Skills.
physical movement. You could break that down into, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this, it,
Yeah.
it connects so nicely. And because you know what, another big question that's coming up right now in a lot of communities that I go to is PDA,
Yeah. Hmm.
which is this new label that I
Yeah.
think I have,
Yeah.
which, you know what I mean? People get
Yeah.
caught up in the PDA, PDA, PDA. What was
Yeah.
it stand for again?
It's a pervasive demand avoidance.
Avoidance. And then
Yeah.
people who have PDA want to call it persistent
Or maybe it is persistent demand avoidance. Yeah. I think it might be
demand
persistent demand
avoidance.
avoidance.
And
I think
people
so.
who have PDA want it to be called persistent something for
Persistent.
autonomy.
Yeah, persistent demand for autonomy, maybe.
Yeah,
Or,
or like desire
yeah,
for autonomy or something
desire for
like
autonomy.
yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
And so I was
yeah.
thinking,
Reframe.
because we get caught up in labels, right? And so when I was
Yeah,
thinking about this yesterday, I was like, okay, so if you have a person who has been diagnosed or whatever as PDA or Down syndrome or autism or all of the things, right? What I like about this kind of the PO model,
mm-hmm.
POE,
POE.
is it takes away the label and just says, who's the person? What's
Yeah,
the environment and what's the
yeah,
demand? Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
regardless if whatever the identity
yeah,
is,
yeah,
if we can get past that and say, okay, is there another way that we can present this activity so that the
yeah,
person can have that autonomy? Like it's I could
yeah.
see that being a useful frame.
Yeah, and it is very client-centered and holistic. And
Yeah.
again, the person component is not what we're expecting the person to do. It is how
Right.
can we, as the people that are supporting them, take
Right.
those factors into account and then help them kind of, get to where they need to.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's a nice simple model. I feel like it's really useful to kind of keep in the back of
Mm.
your mind when you're kind of problem solving.
Yeah.
Because visuals are great. I love a good
I love
visual.
visuals.
Yeah.
This is so useful. Okay, Hina.
Hey.
Now I'm not gonna sleep.
Okay. You're just
Oh,
gonna be POing.
the POing, POing.
POing.
We just made it a verb.
We just made it exactly.
POing,
More.
POing. No, that's so good. Okay, I think I love that answer. I think I love that answer, Hannah. Okay, so my last question for you, because you work with kids across all ages and grades and abilities and interests and strengths and personalities, right? And I think you're such a good example of someone who sees things from a bird's eye view. Because you know what I mean? You're not like you see the kids and the families and then you watch how they're interacting within school settings. And so my question to you is if you were to give I mean, I'm going to say the number one piece of advice, but if you have more than one, I won't say no. Your number one piece of advice to like a general education classroom teacher who has a student in their class and they are just trying to figure out how to do this, what would you say?
Families to provide information to the school team, right? The onus can't be on the school team always asking the questions. So you have to let them know about your child because you're the experts in your kid. So I think that building rapport, that empathetic relationship is so important because it can create that bond of trust with you and your student so that when the struggles do happen, they know that they have this one person that they have this relationship with that they can go to as their home base. So that's one probably big piece of advice I would say.
That is like the most universal piece of advice
Yeah.
ever. Can I tell you a cute story?
Yes, please.
I know I'm not supposed to have favorites, but like I had a student that was like one of them.
Yeah.
And I learned so much from him, and we had this like he came into my class in grade 8 and was him and his whole family. Like everyone's terrified of high school because as soon as you get to high school, usually your kids go to the basement. And so
Yeah.
um but I was also trying to figure out inclusion in my early career, trying to figure out what this looked like. And so I think a lot of us were kind of surprised that we weren't just in the basement. Do you know what I mean? I mean, part of
Yeah.
that is probably because we were in Richmond and there are no basements. But the point
Yes.
is, he was part of my first cohort that where we were trying to figure out how this works for kids in high school.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? And it wasn't perfect and it was hard, right? But me and him learned about each other is what I realized. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
getting to know him also meant that he got to know me. And so he helped me name my dog. Do you know what I mean? Like he came to my wedding. Like we had a very we had a very like a relationship built on knowing each other, which I think also decreased the power imbalance that often escalates, right? It doesn't mean I'm telling him my deepest, darkest secrets, but like I found that one thing that I really learned from him was that like I also have to be vulnerable with him in the way that I'm asking him. And so we had that connection, which was really meaningful for both him and for me. But we're also focusing on inclusion where he's not with me all day. Do you know what I mean? Like he's out in classrooms and he didn't have that connection with everyone. And so there was always this like, we have to go get Miss Moore. We have to go get Miss Moore. Do you know what I mean? Which I, of course, feel good about, but I can't just like
Person.
I can't be at 25 places at one time. And so him and I came together and we're just like, okay, so we have this situation where you're feeling like you need support, but like sometimes I'm not available. So like can we figure out a solution to this? Like, you know what I mean? Like we figured it out together. And one thing that I inherited in my classroom when I moved into it was this giant black leather rolly chair, and it was kind of behind my tables or whatever. And he loved sitting in this chair because he could spin. I mean, spinning feels good to kids, right? And so whenever he would leave class for whatever reason, and I wasn't around, he would be spinning in my chair. And so we're sitting there, and I'm like, "Is there a place you could go that you'll feel safe and you'll feel, you know what I mean, until someone can come connect to you that you have a relationship with? Where could that be?" And this chair became pseudo me for when I wasn't available. But I mean, like, it just was like, so I would come and he'd be like, Miss Moore, I had to sit in the chair today. I'm like, you do that. But then it evolved into like, well, can we bring the chair with you to other places? Because it's on wheels. So I mean, it became this amazing like support for him because the chair represented our connection and relationship, because like I also come from the I don't want people to rely on me all the time because I can't I have like 25, you know what I mean, at kids at one time. But we couldn't have got there unless we had that deep connection, and you know what I mean? And it didn't mean we were together all day, but we knew that, so whether that was like an object or a picture or something that represents a connection, I feel like what I really took from that was that co-construction of support, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Over time. Yeah. Totally. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Creating the space and time to connect because if you don't, it's going to take more time later. It is. It's all about prevention and proactive connection and ugh, I miss him. He passed away. My guy. So he's one of the ones on my heart shelf for sure because like I just learned so much from him, you know? Like I'm so thankful. Oh,
Story's going to teach so many people in the future. So
you know
that's
what?
wonderful.
I often like the word contribution always comes to mind when I think of my students. And sometimes parents will just be like, but why is contribution an expectation? My kids can't contribute. And I'm just like, yeah, they can.
They can. They
They
are.
sure can. And sometimes you don't realize it
Absolutely.
right away, but like,
No.
no, no, like every day I think about those kids that I worked with.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And you have to be open to accepting and
Yeah,
understanding and reflecting on that contribution, right? It might not look like a contribution
totally.
that you would possibly make or your other
Right?
child might possibly make, but each and
Yeah.
every person is willing and able to make a contribution if they're given the space and the opportunity
Yes.
to do it,
Yes.
right?
Because it's
Yeah.
easier for us to change
Exactly.
than Hannah. Hannah, one day my rentals are going to be done and we're going to have you over for dinner. You're going to come to Bowen and we're going to chat with some tea.
Always wanting to come. I'm like, it's so close by. Why don't I just go
No,
on a
you're going to
little
come.
day trip to Bowen Islands? I
No,
would
we're
love
going
to
to
come.
make you dinner
Thank
and
you.
we're going to have some tea and we're going to chat
Love
all
it.
night, not on a podcast.
Can't wait. Yeah, not at all.
Thank you, Hina. Thank you so much for joining
Thank
me.
you.
Friends,
Thank
you
you.
can learn more about Hina, one of our newest outside pins. She offers professional development, and as you know, she's a wealth of knowledge. And so, if you're interested in learning more about what Hina has to bring, check out. Well, is on Instagram. Our website is almost ready to be released, but definitely reach out because we can send you all the information. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.